Is London really the capital of England? I mean, everybody says so, even the World Atlas. But is it really? Stick around. I'm about to find out. Welcome back. I'm Jeff Hicks, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hicks, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. For this episode, we're going to delve into this folder I just came across with just a few stories in it, but fascinating stories about foreign governments. Let's dive in and find out, is London really the capital of England? Here we go. So for our first story, we'll go to Limerick, the town of Limerick in Ireland, where this was a comic strip back in 1944, and at the time, for over 100 years, each mayor of Limerick, Ireland, had added a new link to a traditional chain of gold, which represents each mayor that had held the office. The chain at the time was 9 feet long, with over 57 links weighing 4 pounds. And I looked it up and found the most recent mayor of Limerick is now wearing the same chain that has now up to 78 links. Still a tradition carried today, strange as it seems. This one's interesting. From 1932, strange as it seems, the Netherlands, at the time, is the third largest empire in the world. This is in 1932. Although it was an area equal to only the state of Maryland, the population is 65 million, but it rules an empire, again, in 1932, equal to 1/5 of all Europe, and world trade exceeded only by the United States, Great Britain, and of course Germany at the time. But it was dissolved after World War II. The Dutch colonial empire was, and officially the final last vestiges of the empire were in 1975, when 3 islands in the West Indies, including Aruba, became autonomous countries. And here's a story from my grandfather Ernest Hicks in 1947 from Turkey. On the day the census is taken in Turkey, everyone but the census takers must stay indoors. The reference also mentions one man who, while sitting waiting for the census taker, sat on the curb, and he was arrested for being in the street, strange as it seems. And here's a story from Brazil, from 1943, from the Annals of John Hicks, my grand uncle, about Brazil's constitution, which actually included the actual constitution of Brazil. Fascinating. And apparently the death penalty existed here in the Constitution for crimes of treason or unjustifiable murders. And at this point, 6 years in, not a single person had been accused or arraigned or put to death because of that law. Meanwhile, Ecuador, apparently at this point, had 14 constitutions. Actually, the original article showed 12 constitutions in 1938, but just by a few years later, by 1941, they were up to 14 constitutions since the first was drawn up in 1830. Fascinating. You know, my son came up to me and said, "Dad, I want to be in politics when I grow up." And I said, "Are you insane? Are you a moron? Have you completely lost your mind?" And he said, forget it. I didn't realize there were so many requirements. And here's a community in Mexico, strange as it seems. Looks like the last of the Czarist Russians had moved somewhere to the Guadalupe colony down in Baja, Mexico. Fascinating. Here in 1940, you can see quite a few pictures of the community. A whole bunch of people had basically escaped Tsarist Russia and traveled and set up a colony here. Took a look lately, and apparently in the 1950s, road construction opened up the area where they were, and by the 1990s, there was only one family left, but Czarist Russians living in Mexico. And here's a story I found particularly fascinating. Abyssinia's only treaty of friendship was signed with Italy, which didn't sound that amazing right now, other than the fact that everybody at the time knew that Italy had actually, it was a 20-year treaty signed between Abyssinia and Italy, and then there was a border dispute, and of course this is 1928 when the treaty was, so 8 years later, Mussolini was in power. And so after the dispute happened, Mussolini just moved in and apparently conquered the entire country. Abyssinia is now what's known as Ethiopia. And really kind of a fascinating point in history, I think, because, you know, there was essentially the League of Nations, right, had to kind of arbitrate here. And they really just sort of let this go. It was kind of crazy. Mussolini ignored the League, invaded the Abyssinia. This was October of 1935. The Italians were using planes, bombs, tanks, chemical weapons even. Abyssinians only had horses and rifles. Britain had banned weapons sales to both countries, which obviously hurt Abyssinia much more than Italy. But by June 1936, the Abyssinian Emperor Haile Selassie, of Rastafari fame, went to the League to appeal for help, but did nothing. The League had failed. And I think, you look at that moment in history, what are the consequences, right? The League was shown to be powerless, right? Useless to stop a determined aggressor. And not only that League, but really all agreements now in the 1920s were shown to be completely worthless. So in 1936, the League held a debate. In the period 37 to 39, the League just finally stopped even trying to intervene to stop wars. And so other nations started to realize there's no security in collective security anymore, right? And they set about securing their own safety. And Italy left the League in November of 1937. They claimed that France and Britain were using it as a screen to work against Italy. And of course, this increased the difficulty of achieving diplomatic solutions. Of course, this was in 1939 when this showed up. Prior, right? Hitler had basically taken power, but World War II hadn't even started. But in particular, the USSR, which had joined the League in 1934, fearing German rearmament, realized the League was powerless. And so in 1939, it made the Nazi-Soviet pact with Germany. And of course, Hitler grew in confidence. In 1936, while that crisis was taking place, took advantage, marched into Rhineland in 1938. He annexed Austria and Sudetenland and then took Europe, right, on the road to World War II. Which leads to another fact, very similar in nature, I think, also from 1938. Shows that the German Reichstag did not pass a single law for 2 years. This is from 1930 to 1932. And it wasn't because it really stopped passing laws, but basically the laws were being passed by the president, right, using presidential authority, interestingly enough, and emergency powers. Does that sound familiar? And that continued. So basically the president, who was Hindenburg at the time, just was ignoring the Reichstag or the parliament, right, and just usurped executive control over the government. And of course that continued until the Enabling Act of 1933, which gave Hitler the power to not only enact laws, but also ignore the Reichstag and the president. And as chancellor, Hitler took control over all of Germany. And we all know what happened after that. Interesting story here. As Mark Twain was quoted as saying once, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And speaking of Mark Twain, stay tuned. I just came across a strange as it seems 1930s film short on 16 millimeter that I just digitized that's on Mark Twain. Going to be releasing it here in a few days. So stay tuned. How did we know communism was doomed from the very beginning? It's all the red flags. Which brings us to the question that we asked at the beginning. Is London really the capital of England? Here's the answer. Technically, the UK is not ruled by a monarch anymore. So the fact that it's ruled by the members of parliament shows that it would actually be Westminster and not London. And Westminster, which is apart from the city of London, although it's kind of like here in Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles extends forever and ever, but the city is just the small part. But Greater London, the capital of England, is, certainly the capital of England. But the city of London is the heart of London, the ancient center about which the city grew. The city is actually one of the smallest of the 29 divisions making up Greater London. It's not the largest city in the world by far. In fact, it's one of the smallest. But there's London and there's London, right? And really interesting history, because if we're talking about the city of London, when you go back to 1066, pretty fascinating. When William the Conqueror showed up, right, it was London. The whole place was London. But unfortunately, the people who lived there, they weren't exactly happy about this conquest and all that, and they were pretty much ready to put up a fight. So facing a group of people in the walled fortifications, basically, William instead decided to negotiate. Fascinating. In 1070, he granted the city a charter, and he essentially agreed to let the Anglo-Saxons run the city as they saw fit, while he built castles right next to it, most notably the Tower of London, of course. Keep an eye on them. But, for example, when William compiled the Domesday Book in 1075 to catalog his entire realm, the city of London wasn't even in it. So in modern times, it still holds true. Pretty fascinating. There are several laws that apply everywhere but in London. London has its own police force. It has its own municipal government, which isn't subject to freedom of information laws or human rights legislation. Fascinating. It's not subject to Middlesex County or even the Greater London Authority. It has the authority to set its own additional taxes, although it is subject to the UK taxes. It's not subject to the municipal government reform laws of the 1950s. And it doesn't have to have a one-person, one-vote system. Fascinating. About 8,000 people right now reside in the city, down from over about 100,000 in the 19th century. But certain organizations known as livery companies that represent certain professions in the city appoint their own voting representatives. The oldest of these is the Company of Mercers, the General Merchants, founded in 1394. And the newest is the Company of Nurses, founded in 2023. Fascinating story? Yes, London is the capital of England, but the City of London, not necessarily so. Little fact that you can take with you around the water cooler next time. Thanks so much for joining. If you like content like this, strange and unusual facts, figures, information, all based on fact and corroborated with proof, please hit the bell to subscribe, leave a comment, like, follow. Stay tuned for next week's episode when we return here, as strange as it seems.